right. Hey there, everyone. Welcome this week to our Bible study and our Fully Engaged series. It's great to have you continuing on with us in this journey as we read through the New Testament and hear what Jesus has to say to us, especially this week. So this week I want to invite you into the Gospel of Matthew again. Last week, Pastor Tim covered chapters 5 through 7, and this week we're covering Matthew chapters 8 through 12, about 5 chapters of Matthew's gospel, kind of right in the thick of Jesus' ministry. And so we pick up right away in chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we have all kinds of scenes. It's kind of a blow-by-blow of scenes where Jesus is healing the sick, casting out demons, doing all kinds of different bits of ministry, and it's just one right after another. So really kind of fun to read through. I'm going to read in my Bible here for you just a little bit, Matthew chapter 8. We'll take a look at Jesus healing the centurion's servant. Verse 5. Now when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed in distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed." I love how the centurion, this commander of an army, recognizes the power of Jesus to heal. And he knows that he doesn't need Jesus to come and physically heal his servant. And so he asks Jesus, just speak the word and I know it will be done. And Jesus does this for him. Jesus is actually, we're told in Matthew's gospel, amazed in verse 10. When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." So Jesus recognizes the faith of this centurion, this leader of armies, and his faith in Jesus and wanting his servant healed. And Jesus does just that. In verse 13, Jesus says, "Go, and it will be done for you according to your faith." And the servant was healed in that hour. What a wonderful example of Jesus and his power to heal right there in Matthew's gospel in chapter 8. At the end of chapter 8, we hear Jesus stilling or calming the storm and then healing the Gadarene or the Gerasene demoniacs, sending the demons into the swineherd that jump off the cliff. Many of you will remember that story as well. And then in chapter 9, Jesus continues on with his healing a paralytic man. And one of the most fascinating parts of this whole section, at least to me, is Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. We're given no other context about this man named Matthew other than that he's a tax collector. Jesus says to him, "Follow me," and Matthew gets up and does it. It's an amazing act of faith and trust in Jesus as Jesus calls Matthew to follow him and to serve alongside him in ministry. We'll hear a little bit more about Matthew in the next chapter as Jesus begins to send out his 12 disciples to do the work that he's been doing, that work of healing and casting out demons. Jesus sends out his disciples. But we hear of Matthew's call. And I'm always intrigued by Matthew the tax collector as well. His job as a tax collector is one that probably was not very well favored by others in the community because they would often skim money off the top of the tax collection for themselves. And so we hear in chapter 9 as well that Jesus actually gets pressed about this hanging out with tax collectors and calling them to be his disciples. There are some Pharisees in verse 11 who see Jesus eating dinner with tax collectors and sinners. And those Pharisees come to his disciples and say, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus hears this, he says to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." What a great word that Jesus has for all of us who find ourselves maybe on that end of life where we are wondering if we're good enough, right? If we've been well-behaved enough to earn God's favor. We learn, of course, that it's not about earning God's favor, but instead Jesus and God call the sinner, not the righteous, and call them to work in his kingdom. So we go on, and Jesus continues his healing and calling his disciples again in chapter 10 out into the mission field. And chapter 10, verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of God has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons." Jesus sends his disciples out into the world to do the work that he's been doing all along. And he sends us too. Now, the tricky thing about being Jesus' disciples, as we read in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, Jesus says, "See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." We know that this call to discipleship, this call to follow Jesus, is not an easy road to follow. We know that Jesus sends us out like sheep into the midst of wolves sometimes, that this work of curing the sick and casting out demons in his name and proclaiming the good news, this work is difficult. Following Jesus is not always easy, and Jesus reminds us of that in Matthew 10. We continue on then, and Jesus talks more about the cost of discipleship in verse 34 and following, when Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." Jesus goes on, "Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Discipleship is costly, Jesus says. And then finally, in Matthew chapter 11, we get this brief interlude of John the Baptist in prison, and we get to hear a little bit about what Jesus thinks of him. And in chapter 12, Jesus continues on in his work of healing and casting out demons, and in doing so, making the Pharisees upset, of course. And this work will eventually, as we know, lead Jesus to the cross and his crucifixion. And all of that is coming. And in this season of Lent, as we read along together in the New Testament, in Matthew's Gospel, we'll get to hear these stories that lead to the cross of Christ, and ultimately then to our resurrection, his resurrection first, and our own as well. So hey, thanks for joining us. It's been great to have you along in this journey. Would love to have you continue with us. Let's stay fully engaged, and let's go, Gloria Dei.